By early 1944, Europe stood at a crossroads shaped not by sudden drama, but by years of expectation, fear, and preparation under uncertainty. The Second World War had entered a phase in which the outcome was no longer entirely opaque, yet the path to victory remained fraught with peril. The Allied powers had survived their weakest years. Nazi Germany, though still formidable, was no longer advancing relentlessly. Instead, it was reacting, adjusting, fortifying, and waiting. Nowhere was this tension more evident than in Western Europe. On the Eastern Front, the German army was being driven steadily westward. The vast campaigns that had once promised Hitler limitless conquest had become wars of attrition and retreat. Entire formations were consumed by the scale of the fighting. The Wehrmacht still fought with discipline and determination, but the initiative had shifted. The war that Hitler had once believed would be swift and decisive was grinding his forces down. Yet for all the bloodshed in the East, it was not the Red Army that most concerned German planners in early 1944. A far greater uncertainty haunted Berlin. The long-anticipated Anglo-American invasion of Western Europe, Hitler had feared it for years. Since the fall of France in 1940, the German leadership had known that Britain, so long as it remained unconquered, would eventually seek a return to the continent. The United States' entry into the war only sharpened that inevitability. The question that obsessed German intelligence officers, generals, and Hitler himself was not if an invasion would come, but when, and more critically, where. Across the Channel, in Britain, preparations were underway that dwarfed anything previously attempted in modern warfare. Yet even among the Allies, certainty remained elusive. The invasion of Western Europe would be the most complex amphibious operation ever conceived, and it would succeed or fail not simply on bravery or numbers, but on planning, timing, and the ability to learn from past mistakes. This was the paradox of early 1944. Both sides were preparing intensely for the same event, yet neither side fully understood how unprepared they truly were. A war of anticipation, the long road to what would later be called D-Day, did not begin with landing craft assembling in English ports or paratroopers rehearsing jumps. It began years earlier, in the aftermath of early defeats and hard-earned lessons. For the Allies, the central challenge was strategic. Britain had survived the darkest days of 1940 and 1941, but survival alone could not defeat Nazi Germany. As long as Hitler controlled Western Europe, the war could not be decisively won. A return to the continent was unavoidable, yet the Allies faced a cruel dilemma: to invade too early, without sufficient strength or preparation, risked catastrophe. To wait too long allowed Germany to strengthen its defenses, fortify its coastline, and prepare for exactly the kind of assault the Allies envisioned. This tension defined Allied planning throughout the war years. Churchill, in particular, understood both the necessity and the danger of invasion. He had witnessed the disastrous amphibious campaigns of the First World War and knew that attacking a defended coastline was among the most perilous operations imaginable. The Allies could not afford to repeat old mistakes, but they also could not remain indefinitely on the defensive. Thus, preparation became a process of testing, learning, and adapting, often through failure. Germany's defensive mindset. On the German side, the challenge was no less complex. Hitler's strategic worldview was shaped by ideology as much as military logic. He believed that the Anglo-American powers would eventually strike across the Channel, and he believed that the fate of the Reich might hinge on repelling that blow. Yet this expectation did not translate into strategic clarity. Germany's resources were stretched across multiple fronts. The demands of the Eastern Front consumed men, armor, and material at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, Allied bombing campaigns strained German industry and infrastructure. The Reich could not be strong everywhere at once. Western Europe, however, held symbolic and strategic importance. It was here that Germany had achieved its most dramatic early victories. It was also here that Hitler believed the Allies would attempt to reverse them. As a result, German preparations took on a defensive character marked by scale rather than coherence. Hitler's answer to the invasion threat was fortification. The illusion of security from Berlin's perspective, the coastline of Western Europe presented both a vulnerability and an opportunity. Stretching from the cold waters of Scandinavia down to the Spanish border, it was impossibly long to defend in its entirety. Yet it also offered countless potential choke points where an attacker could be repelled if the defenses were strong enough. This was the logic behind the Atlantic Wall. Begun in 1941, the Atlantic Wall was envisioned as a continuous chain of fortifications that would deny the Allies any safe landing. Concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, mines, and obstacles would transform beaches into killing zones. The very act of landing, German planners believed, would doom any invading force before it could establish itself ashore. Hitler embraced the idea enthusiastically. Fortifications appealed to his belief in monumental solution structures that projected strength, permanence, and inevitability. He boasted of his role as a builder, convinced that concrete and steel could compensate for shortages elsewhere. Yet the Atlantic Wall also revealed a deeper problem. It was a response to fear rather than certainty. The wall did not solve the central strategic question of where the invasion would come. It attempted, instead, to answer all possibilities at once. In doing so, it spread German resources thin and obscured unresolved disagreements within the command structure. Allies in waiting meanwhile, in Britain, the mood was one of intense preparation mixed with restrained urgency. The island had become a vast military staging ground. Soldiers from across the Allied world trained relentlessly, often without knowing when or even where they would be sent. What they shared was an awareness of the stakes. The opening of a second front was not merely a military operation, it was a political and moral commitment. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the fighting against Germany. Allied leaders understood that failure to strike in the West would have profound consequences for the war's outcome and for post-war Europe. Yet understanding necessity did not eliminate uncertainty. Allied planners were acutely aware that they were attempting something unprecedented. Amphibious operations required mastery of sea, land, and air in perfect coordination. Weather, tides, enemy defenses, and logistics all posed existential risks. A single miscalculation could doom the entire enterprise. As a result, Allied strategy in the years leading up to 1944 was marked by caution tempered with experimentation. They probed, they tested, they failed, and learned. Those lessons, still incomplete by early 1944, would shape everything to come. Two sides, one question by the beginning of 1944, both the Allies and Nazi Germany were trapped in a strange symmetry. Both knew that Western Europe would be the decisive theater. Both expected an invasion, both believed preparation was the key to survival. Yet neither side possessed full certainty. German commanders debated how best to deploy their limited forces. Allied planners debated how to overcome defenses they had never faced before. Intelligence flowed imperfectly on both sides, filtered through assumptions, biases, and fear. The war had become one of anticipation rather than action, of waiting rather than striking. The irony was profound. The longer both sides waited, the more they prepared for a future they could not fully predict. Every decision made in this period, every bunker poured, every rehearsal conducted carried consequences that would only become clear once the invasion began. By 1944, Europe was not simply on the brink of liberation or defeat. It was on the brink of revelation. Years of planning would soon be tested in a matter of hours. But before that moment could arrive, both sides still had lessons to learn, lessons written not in victory, but in failure. The road to the invasion of Western Europe was paved not with confidence, but with doubt. Long before Allied soldiers would step onto the beaches of Normandy, planners in London and Washington were haunted by a single question: could such an invasion succeed at all? History offered few encouraging examples. Amphibious warfare was among the most complex forms of military operation. It demanded absolute coordination between naval forces, ground troops, air power, and logistics. Any weakness, any delay, miscalculation, or miscommunication could lead to disaster. The Allies knew this not in theory, but through experience. Their understanding of what not to do came at a terrible price: the need to test the enemy. From the earliest years of the war, Winston Churchill believed that Britain could not afford to remain passive. Even while the nation fought for survival, Churchill insisted on striking back, probing German defenses, keeping pressure on occupied Europe, and forcing Hitler to divert resources away from other fronts. These early raids were never intended to liberate territory. They were experiments. The goal was to test German reactions, gather intelligence, and understand how an invasion force might fare against the defenses of Fortress Europe. Each raid was a controlled risk, undertaken with the knowledge that losses were likely, but that ignorance would be far more costly in the long run. One such experiment unfolded far to the north, along the rugged coastline of occupied Norway, the Norway raid, learning in small steps. In December 1941, British commandos struck the Viggy Islands off Norway's coast. The target was not a major port or city, but a fish oil factory, part of Germany's war economy and nearby coastal defenses. The raid was swift and violent. Commandos landed, destroyed their objectives, engaged German forces, and withdrew before a large response could be mounted. On the surface, it was a minor operation, but its consequences extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted. German leadership reacted strongly. Hitler, already fearful of an Allied landing in Norway, interpreted the raid as confirmation that invasion could come anywhere, at any time. Troops were diverted to defend the Norwegian coastline forces that would otherwise have been available elsewhere. For the Allies, the raid provided something equally valuable: insight. They learned that surprise was possible, that limited objectives could be achieved with speed and coordination, and that German responses, while fierce, were often shaped as much by fear as by strategy. Yet small successes could not answer the larger question: could an invasion succeed against a fully prepared, heavily fortified enemy? To answer that, the Allies would attempt something far more ambitious and far more dangerous: Dieppe, a necessary disaster. By 1942, pressure was mounting on Allied leaders to demonstrate progress. The Soviet Union demanded relief in the West. Public opinion in Britain and Canada expected action. Military planners sought a test that would reveal the realities of attacking a defended coastline. The result was the raid on Dieppe. Dieppe was not chosen at random. It was a fortified port on the French coast, protected by cliffs, concrete defenses, and German artillery. Planners believed that capturing it, even briefly, would yield invaluable intelligence and prove that a major landing was feasible. It was a gamble born of urgency. On the morning of the raid, Canadian and British forces approached the French coast under cover of darkness. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. German defenses were alert. As landing craft approached the beach, they were met by devastating fire. Machine guns, artillery, and mortar tore into the advancing troops. Tanks, meant to provide crucial fire support, struggled the moment they landed. The beach's shingle bogged them down, immobilizing vehicles that had been expected to break through German positions. Communications failed, units became pinned down. Reinforcements could not be landed effectively. What was meant to be a sharp, probing strike turned into a slaughter. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. Entire units were destroyed. By the time the order to withdraw was given, the operation had already become synonymous with failure. Dieppe was, by every conventional measure, a disaster. And yet, it would become one of the most important learning experiences of the war. Lessons written in blood, the aftermath of Dieppe forced Allied planners to confront uncomfortable truths. First and foremost, the raid demonstrated that a direct assault on a heavily defended port was suicidal. Ports were obvious targets and therefore the most strongly defended. Any invasion plan that relied on seizing a port intact was fundamentally flawed. Second, Dieppe revealed the limits of armor in amphibious operations. Tanks could not simply be landed and expected to perform as they did on open ground. Terrain mattered, beach composition mattered, engineering support mattered. Third, the raid exposed the necessity of overwhelming air and naval support. German positions had not been sufficiently neutralized before the landings. Defenses remained intact, able to fire freely on exposed troops. Finally, Dieppe underscored the need for detailed intelligence and specialized equipment. The Allies could not improvise their way through a landing. Every aspect from obstacles to tides would have to be studied in advance. These lessons came at a terrible cost, but they reshaped Allied thinking. The invasion of Europe could not be rushed. It could not rely on hope, and it could not be attempted until the Allies possessed both the means and the knowledge to succeed. Germany draws its own conclusions ironically. Dieppe also influenced German strategy, though not always in productive ways. From the German perspective, the failed raid confirmed their belief that the Atlantic Wall worked. German propaganda trumpeted the defeat as proof that any Allied invasion would be crushed at the shoreline. Hitler, in particular, drew confidence from what he saw as validation of his defensive strategy. This confidence, however, masked deeper problems. Dieppe reinforced the idea that the Allies would target ports. German defenses around key harbors were strengthened further, sometimes at the expense of less obvious stretches of coastline. The very lesson the Allies had learned, that ports were death traps, was not fully absorbed by German planners. Instead of questioning their assumptions, German leadership doubled down on them. The slow evolution of Allied strategy in Britain, Dieppe became a turning point. The raid's failures were dissected relentlessly. Reports were written, debates held, and doctrines were written. The Allies accepted that invasion was not merely a matter of courage or numbers, it was a problem of engineering, logistics, and deception. They also accepted something equally important: failure was not optional. The next attempt to return to Europe would not be a raid, it would be a decisive blow. And if it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic not only militarily, but politically and morally. As a result, Allied planners shifted from improvisation to innovation. They would not attack where the enemy expected. They would not rely on existing ports. They would not repeat Dieppe. Instead, they would rethink the invasion from first principles. Preparation as survival. By the end of 1942, the character of Allied preparation had changed. Training intensified, intelligence gathering expanded. New technologies were explored not as luxuries, but as necessities. Every failure, from Norway to Dieppe, fed into a growing body of hard-earned knowledge. The Allies were learning not how to win quickly, but how to avoid losing decisively. This learning process was slow, painful, and often invisible to those not directly involved. But it was reshaping the future of the war. While soldiers drilled and planners argued, Germany continued to fortify its coast, convinced that concrete and firepower would suffice. Both sides believed they were adapting, only one truly was. The stage was now set for a confrontation not just between armies, but between ideas, between flexibility and rigidity, innovation and assumption. And nowhere would that confrontation be clearer than in the concrete defenses stretching along Europe's western shore. By 1943, the war in Europe had entered a decisive phase. The question was no longer whether the Allies would attempt a return to the continent, but whether Germany could stop them when they did. The answer, German leaders believed, lay in fortification, discipline, and the careful use of dwindling resources. Yet beneath the surface of concrete bunkers and propaganda boasts, German strategy in the West was fractured by disagreement, uncertainty, and a fatal inability to resolve competing visions of defense. The Atlantic Wall stood as both a symbol of German determination and a monument to strategic indecision. Commitment to invasion on the Allied side, hesitation was giving way to commitment. By 1943, American industrial power was fully engaged, and Allied forces had gained experience across multiple theaters. At a high-level conference in Washington, Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt made a decision that would shape the remainder of the war. The invasion of Western Europe would take place in the summer of 1944. The operation was given a name Operation Overlord, but a name alone did not make it feasible. Overlord would require unprecedented coordination between nations, services, and commanders. It would demand absolute air superiority, vast naval resources, and the movement of hundreds of thousands of men across a narrow but deadly stretch of water. For Germany, this decision, though unknown in its details, was expected in principle. Intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance, and political logic all pointed toward an invasion. What remained uncertain was where the blow would fall. The Atlantic Wall takes shape. Germany's answer to this uncertainty was to build. Construction of the Atlantic Wall had begun as early as 1941, but by 1943 it became an obsession. Resources that might have been used to reinforce mobile units or replenish losses elsewhere were instead poured into concrete. Beaches were mined, steel obstacles were driven into the sand to tear open landing craft. Gun emplacements were hardened against bombardment. Bunkers were positioned to rake beaches with overlapping fields of fire. From Denmark to the Bay of Biscay, the coastline was transformed. To Hitler, the Atlantic Wall represented more than military necessity. It was a statement of permanence, a declaration that Germany's control of Western Europe was unassailable. He boasted openly of his role as a builder, convinced that fortifications could compensate for Germany's strategic overstretch. But the wall was never as continuous or as strong as propaganda suggested. Its construction varied widely by region. Some areas were heavily defended. Others remained vulnerable due to shortages of labor, materials, and time. The very length of the coastline ensured that defenses would always be uneven. More importantly, the wall could not resolve the fundamental question of how Germany should fight the invasion once it began, Rundstedt's dilemma. At the top of Germany's Western command structure stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. A veteran officer, Rundstedt understood the strategic reality facing Germany. In 1944, the Wehrmacht could not hope to repel the Allies everywhere at once. It would have to react decisively once the main invasion site was identified. Rundstedt's solution was based on traditional operational thinking. He argued that Germany should not attempt to stop the invasion at the shoreline. Instead, coastal defenses should delay the enemy while powerful armored reserves were held inland. Once the Allies revealed their main landing area, these reserves could be launched in a concentrated counterattack, driving the invaders back into the sea. This approach recognized Germany's limitations. It accepted that the coastline could not be defended in its entirety and placed faith in mobility and concentration of force. But it also relied on a critical assumption that German armored units would be able to move freely once the invasion began. Rommel's counterargument, that assumption, was precisely what Field Marshal Erwin Rommel rejected. Rommel, appointed to oversee aspects of the Atlantic Wall, brought with him the hard lessons of North Africa. Their Allied air power had dominated the battlefield, crippling German movement and logistics. Rommel had seen firsthand how quickly armored units could be destroyed when exposed to enemy aircraft. To Rommel, the idea of holding tanks inland was fantasy. He believed that once the Allies landed, their control of the air would make any large-scale movement impossible. Roads would be bombed, columns would be detected and destroyed before they reached the front. If Germany waited, it would be too late. Rommel's solution was blunt and urgent. The invasion must be stopped at the beaches. Tanks, artillery, and infantry had to be positioned as close to the coast as possible. The Allies had to be crushed in the first hours before they could bring their overwhelming strength to bear. There would be no second chance. Rommel's argument was rooted in realism, but it carried risks of its own. Stationing armored units near the coast made them vulnerable to naval gunfire and air attack. It also limited flexibility if the Allies landed elsewhere. Hitler's fatal compromise. Faced with two competing strategies, Hitler did what he often did when confronted with disagreement among his commanders. He compromised. Rather than choosing one approach and committing fully, Hitler attempted to blend them. Some armored units were held inland, others placed closer to the coast. Authority over these reserves was fragmented, with critical decisions requiring Hitler's personal approval. The result satisfied no one. There were too few tanks positioned to smash an invasion at the beaches. There were too few reserves held back to launch a decisive counterattack. Command delays and confusion were built into the system before the invasion even began. This compromise was not merely a tactical error, it was a structural flaw. By refusing to make a clear choice, Hitler ensured that Germany's response to the invasion would be slow, disjointed, and ineffective. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, could not compensate for uncertainty at the top. The illusion of readiness to the outside observer, Germany in 1943 appeared prepared. Propaganda films showcased fortifications, reports emphasized German resolve. Hitler assured his inner circle that the Atlantic Wall would break any Allied assault. Yet beneath the surface, the system was brittle. Troops manning the wall varied in quality, with many formations under strength or composed of less experienced soldiers. Equipment shortages persisted, training was uneven, and above all, the command structure was paralyzed by indecision. Germany had built a defense designed to fight every possible invasion and, in doing so, had prepared to fight none effectively. Paths diverge. As 1943 drew to a close, the contrast between Allied and German preparation grew sharper. The Allies were refining a single, coherent plan. Every lesson from earlier failures was being integrated. Innovation was encouraged, and assumptions were challenged. Germany, by contrast, was entrenching itself literally and figuratively. It invested in static defenses while failing to resolve fundamental strategic disagreements. Both sides believed they were ready, only one side had truly prepared for uncertainty. The final choice where the invasion would strike had not yet been revealed. But when it came, it would expose the consequences of every decision made in these years of preparation. The stage was set for the greatest gamble of the war. While German commanders argued over how best to defend the coast of Europe, Allied planners faced a challenge just as daunting: deciding where to strike. The success or failure of the invasion would hinge not only on strength and preparation, but on choice. A single decision made months before the first landing craft ever touched sand would shape the fate of Western Europe. This decision was not obvious. It was not easy, and it was anything but safe. It was a gamble born from the lessons of failure and the recognition that predictability was the enemy of success. The invasion question. By 1943, Allied leadership had accepted that Operation Overlord would go forward. The debate now centered on execution. The invasion needed beaches suitable for landing large numbers of troops, proximity to Britain for air support, and terrain that allowed expansion inland. It also needed something less tangible but equally vital: surprise. Two main options emerged. The Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, appeared at first glance to be the logical choice. It offered the shortest crossing, making supply easier and reducing exposure at sea. Ports lay nearby, roads led directly toward Germany. From a purely geographic standpoint, it made sense. That was precisely the problem. Pas-de-Calais was too obvious. German planners had long identified it as the most likely invasion site. Its defenses were among the strongest along the Atlantic Wall. Any Allied landing there would face the full weight of Germany's expectations and preparations. The alternative, Normandy, was less intuitive. It lay farther west, requiring a longer crossing. It lacked major ports. Its beaches were less famous, less studied, and, crucially, less heavily defended. Choosing Normandy meant embracing complexity in exchange for surprise. The decision fell to General Frederick Morgan, tasked with developing the initial invasion framework. His conclusion was clear: success depended on wrong-footing the enemy. Normandy was chosen not because it was easy, but because it was unexpected. Turning knowledge into power once the decision was made, preparation intensified to an unprecedented degree. The Allies could not afford guesswork. Normandy had to be understood in intimate detail: its tides, currents, beach gradients, soil composition, and defenses. What could not be known from maps would be discovered by men willing to risk their lives. Reconnaissance aircraft flew endlessly over northern France, photographing every mile of coastline. Analysts pored over images, identifying gun emplacements, obstacles, and weak points. The French resistance provided ground-level intelligence, reporting on German movements and construction. In some cases, Allied personnel went even further. Small teams crept ashore under cover of darkness to collect sand samples. The texture of the beaches mattered. Tanks and vehicles would behave very differently on soft sand than on firm ground. The failure at Dieppe had taught that lesson brutally. Normandy became the most studied coastline in military history. Yet knowledge alone could not solve every problem. The port dilemma no issue loomed larger than logistics. An invasion force, once ashore, would require a constant flow of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, reinforcements. Traditionally, such supply depended on ports. But Dieppe had shown that capturing a port in the opening phase of an invasion was nearly impossible. Ports were natural fortresses. The Germans knew this. Any attempt to seize one intact would invite disaster. The Allies faced a stark choice: delay the invasion until a port could be captured, or find another way. The solution they devised was extraordinary. Rather than seizing ports, they would bring ports with them, innovation over force. British engineers proposed a concept so radical it bordered on the unbelievable: artificial harbors, constructed in sections, towed across the English Channel, and assembled off the Normandy coast. These massive concrete structures would form breakwaters and piers, allowing ships to unload directly onto the beaches. They would transform open coastline into functional supply hubs, independent of existing ports. The idea reflected everything the Allies had learned since Dieppe. Where brute force failed, innovation would succeed. Where predictability invited defeat, creativity would create opportunity. The artificial harbors were not merely engineering marvels, they were statements of intent. The Allies were no longer reacting to German defenses. They were redefining the rules of invasion itself, German blind spots. Even as Allied preparations reached new levels of sophistication, German command remained constrained by its assumptions. German intelligence recognized the possibility of an invasion in Normandy, but it was not considered the primary threat. Pas-de-Calais continued to dominate German expectations. Defenses there remained stronger, reserves closer. The Atlantic Wall, for all its scale, could not compensate for this imbalance. Meanwhile, the internal divisions within German command persisted. Rommel continued to push for stronger beach defenses. Rundstedt remained skeptical of relying solely on coastal resistance. Hitler's compromise remained in place, ensuring confusion at the moment clarity would be needed most. Germany believed it was ready, it was not. Readiness without understanding. By the end of 1943, both sides stood poised on the edge of action. The Allies believed they had solved the invasion puzzle. They had learned from failure, embraced innovation, and committed fully to a single plan. Their preparations reflected flexibility, realism, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. Germany believed its fortifications would hold. It trusted in concrete, discipline, and the belief that the enemy would strike where logic dictated. Neither side fully understood what the coming summer would reveal. The invasion, when it came, would not be decided solely by courage on the beaches. It would be the result of years of preparation, of choices made in conference rooms and planning offices, of lessons learned and lessons ignored. D-Day would be the moment when preparation met reality, and reality would be unforgiving.